In this chapter, we'll learn about element interactions. In test automation projects, there are typically two layers. One is known as the framework layer, and the other is known as the test layer. If we go to our project view, and we look under this source folder, we notice that there are two folders here, one for main and one for test. The main folder is where people typically put their framework. The test folder is where people typically put their tests. All of your interactions with the web browser, basically all of the coding that's done under the covers of the application, should be in your framework. And your test files should just focus on the test itself. Let's demonstrate this using an example. So here's our test application again. Things like finding the elements and clicking on them are things that should be done in the framework. Your test itself wouldn't focus on finding a specific element by its locator. It simply knows that, hey, I want to click one of these links. So your test would do things like specify, I want to click a link. And the internals of how that link gets clicked should be in your framework section. So we're going to use a pattern called the page object model design pattern. And this is one of the most popular design patterns in test automation. Now, it's not the only way to design your framework, but again, it is the most popular. So that's what we'll use in this course. So the way the page object model design pattern works is that you create a class in your framework section of the project that represents a page in your application. And for every page in your application, you'd create a new class in the framework section of your project. So this is our home page. Let's go ahead and create a class in the framework section of our project. So again, the framework section is called main. Under main, we have this Java folder. Let's go ahead and create a new package under here, and we'll call this package pages. And this will represent our page object classes. So we want to make one to correspond to the home page of the application. So let's do a new Java class, and we'll call this home page. It's a nice convention to have the word page in your class somewhere so that you know what this represents. So in your page object class, what you want to have are fields that represent the elements on a page and then methods to interact with those elements. Let's look at our application again. So there are a lot of things here. Theoretically, we could create elements for all of these different links, as well as these titles. But that would be a bit overkill. It's recommended that you only create what you need at the time, and then you add on as you need more scenarios automated. So let's just take a scenario and we'll build out the page object model for that scenario. Let's say that we want to log into the application. So there is a link here called form authentication. In our scenario, we're going to click this link, and then we are going to enter data into the username and the password fields. And then we're going to click on this login button. So this login page is actually a new page, which means it would need a new class if we were to follow the page object model design pattern. So let's not worry about that one just now. On the home page, all we need is to click this link. So let's just create the elements and the methods to do this. As we learned in the last chapter, in order to interact with any of the elements, you must know the locator. So let's go ahead and get the locator for this link. So we see here that this is an A element, and it has this form authentication as the title of the link. So let's go ahead and use that as our identifier. So we're going to create this as a by locator. So we're going to make this private because it is a field and we're practicing encapsulation. And we'll use the by type, import it, and we're going to give this a name. So this represents the form authentication link. And we'll set this equal to by.link text and then pass in that text. And so this is a field, and this represents the link. Now we want to create a method to allow our test to interact with that link. So we'll create a public method, and for now let's say void, and then we give this method a name. It's nice to make sure that it's expressing what it is that you're actually doing. So we can call this click form authentication. And what this method will do is it's going to need to do a find element, passing in this by. But in order to do find element, we're going to need the WebDriver object. And we don't have that just yet. So we're going to create a constructor, which will specify that when you instantiate this class, you must pass in the WebDriver. And we'll use that driver in order to interact with the web page. So we'll go here and we'll create the constructor. And we'll say you must pass in a WebDriver. And then we want to store this WebDriver. So let's go ahead and create a field for it as well. And then we'll say this.driver equals driver. So what will be passed in here is the actual driver that has launched the browser already. And so the session will already be open and in play. So we'll just continue using that driver to interact with the website. Now that we have our driver, we can go back to this click form authentication method. And we can say driver.findElement and then pass it in our form authentication link. So this will find the web element, and then we need to take an action on that web element. So we'll choose to click it, and this will click the link. Now, going back to our application, if we click this form authentication link, we're actually taken to a new page. It's custom in the page object model design pattern that if your action changes the page, then you should now return a handle to that new page. So from our method of clicking on that link, we should return a login page object. Let's do that. So instead of void, we're going to change this to login page. It's red now because we haven't created it, and that's okay. We'll do that in a moment. And then we'll just say return new login page. And this will also need a driver because all of the pages will need a driver in order to interact with the browser. So we want to pass in this same driver that we already have that already has an open session, and we're going to send that over to the login page so that it can continue to interact with the browser. Let's create this class. I'm just going to copy this and I'm going to go back here. So where should this login page class be created? Well, it's going to represent a page in the application. So we know that it's going to go into the framework section, and we have this package called pages. So we're going to just create another class in here, and this one will be called login page. And we click OK. Now again, we already know that this will need to have a WebDriver. And it'll need to have a constructor that takes that WebDriver. Okay, let's look at home page again, and now that error is gone. So back to login page, let's see what we need in here. Going to our application, we know we need to enter a username, so we're going to need to inspect this username field and get the handle for that. We're going to need this password field, and we're going to need this login button. So that's 3 elements that we have to interact with for our test. So that's 3 fields that we'll add in our page object model class, and then 3 methods to interact with them. So let's go ahead and inspect this username field, and we see here that it has an ID of username. So let's add that to our framework. So we'll make a private by, and we'll call this username field equals by.id and pass it the ID. Let's do the same for the password field. So the password field has an ID of password. We'll use that for our field. And finally, let's get the login button. So this one, we have this button here, and it doesn't have an ID. It has a type submit, but we can see we can go up and maybe find a better locator here by its parent, perhaps. Yes, so this form does have an ID, so we could say find the login form and then the button under there. So we can use a CSS selector. So I'm going to do Control F so that I can test out the selector. We want to say find us an ID called login that's followed by a button, and that will get us the login button. Great. So let's use that. And this time we're using CSS selector. Great. So we have our fields. Now we need our methods to interact with those fields. Let's create those. So we'll call this set username, and our test will need to pass in the username that it wants us to use. So we'll just call that username, and we can say driver dot find element. Give it the username field that we have defined there, and then say dot. Now the method to type in text is send keys, and send keys basically means to type it in. So the keys that we want to send in is the username field that was given to us. So you pass in that, and this will set that text field. Now, in doing that, there's no page change or anything like that. So it's fine to have this return type as void. Now let's do the same thing for the password field. Okay, so now we have a button. So let's say public, and we need to specify a return type. Well, let's see what happens when we click on the button. So if I enter Tom Smith and this super secret password exclamation point, and then I click the login, we see that now we have been taken to a new page called Secure Area. So we've changed the page. It's our method's responsibility to return a handle to this new page. So we'll make a new class for Secure Area. So our return type here will be Secure Area Page, which we haven't created yet. And this method, we'll call it Click Login Button. That doesn't need to accept anything. And so we say driver.findElement. We give it the login button field, and then we say dot click. Knowing after that clicks, the page has been turned, so we return a new Secure Area Page and give it the driver. So let's create this page. Again, this will be in our framework. Under Pages, new Java class, we paste in that name. And of course, this will need the WebDriver, as well as a constructor. Now, let's go back to our application and see what is it that we need, if anything, of this page. So for our scenario, once we've logged in, we see this banner here that says you are logged into a secure area. So we can check to make sure that that's there. So in order to check to make sure that's there, we'll need to add a field that represents this element and a method to read it. So let's go ahead and inspect this. And we see here we have an ID called Flash. So let's go ahead and test this out to make sure it's the only one. So we say, how many elements have this ID? 1 of 1. So that's great. It's a unique identifier. We'll use this. So let's go ahead and create this. And we'll call it status alert. And we'll create a method to interact with that status alert. So what we want to do is read the text from that alert. So we want to return a string, which will represent the text. So we can say get alert text. And we will say driver.find, and we give it the status alert. And we can use this method called getText. And this will return the text of that element. Let me show you. So if we go back to our page, we see here under this div that this is the text inside of this element. So that's what will be returned. Now this will get the text. We need to return it, so we add the word return here. Okay, so that is all that we needed. Let's make sure this compiles. Yes, this is all that we need in order to complete the scenario. Let's revisit the base test class. In this class, we have find elements and find elements calls. These are interactions on the website. Now, if we look in our project structure, we see that base test is not in the framework. It's in the test section. And therefore, these types of interactions are not encouraged. These are framework level things. So let's go ahead and remove those. We don't need them anymore anyway. So let's remove this code. And after we launch the application, what we're going to do is provide a handle to that home page, because that's where we are now. So let's make another variable here. And we'll make this one protected, and I'll explain this a bit later. And we'll say home page and call this home page. And then after we launch the application, we can go ahead and instantiate home page and pass it the driver. So what we've done here is provided a handle in our test layer to our application. And we'll talk more about that in the next section.